Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
Dr David Clark.
Mr Speaker, I rise to announce the Labour Party's support for this bill, at least through to the Select Committee stage. It is very nice to be able to support a government bill in the health area. We are painfully aware of the effects of the $1.7 billion in cuts to the health sector by this government, and I guess perhaps we should note that it comes from the Honourable Peter Dunn, who is a member of a minor party in the government rather than the major party that seems to be increasingly out of touch with ordinary New Zealand and the aspirations of ordinary New Zealand, which include being able to go to the doctor, being able to have affordable and accessible quality medical care, and that goes for the vulnerable, of course, as well as everyone else. So Labour will support this first reading to update the Alcoholism and Drug Addiction Act in 1966. It is 50, sorry? Replace, my apologies, the Minister is correct to replace it. The Act is 50 years old. It is time to be replaced. It is not in line with modern clinical practice and delivery. So it would be good to see, it is good to see the recommendations of the Law Commission being picked up and finally put into legislation. Under the current 50-year-old legislation, 2 medical certificates are required to make an application to the court for compulsory treatment, and neither have to come from a specialist drug or alcohol practitioner. And we, therefore, on this side of the House, support the idea that it will be a requirement that compulsory treatment can only start via an approved list of specialists when the criteria for compulsory treatment is met. It seems a sensible step. There are, of course, risks that go with change, and we must safeguard the rights of patients undergoing compulsory treatment. There's a risk that these new measures are taken up in greater number because it's seen to be more relevant or shorter term, or for whatever reason. These are the debates, as the Minister points out, that we will have in Select Committee. And there is a risk that in that process, with more people going through the system, that the safeguards are not observed in the way that they might be. But these are risks, I think, worth taking, because it is time to update this legislation. There is no doubt about that. But we just must find the balance so that patients have the same rights as those held under mental health legislation existing. A shorter time period, as we've said, 8 weeks, with the option of extension, with the goal of moving to an individual or voluntary treatment, moving the individual into voluntary treatment, seems a far more progressive approach to treating severe substance abuse where patients are unable to make a treatment decision. It is a transition, and ultimately we want the patient, insofar as they are able to take responsibility as a part of their own care and rehabilitation back to the state they would like to be in. The statutory period for treatment under the current legislation is 2 years, which far exceeds the timeframe needed for treatment in many cases. The regulatory impact statement indicates a best guess of 200 orders per year being the result of this legislation, as opposed to the 70 that are currently the case. And on this side of the House, we want to raise questions about whether that will be adequately funded. The regulatory impact statement makes the claim that there will be net economic benefits, and there is a study quoted, an American study, which says, and this is from the regulatory impact statement provided by the government, that it is estimated that for every dollar spent on addiction treatment programs, there is a $4 to $7 reduction in the costs associated with drug-related crimes. With some non-residential programs, total savings can exceed costs by a ratio of 12 to 1. Now, we must take that, of course, with a grain of salt. It's coming from the USA. It's not looking at the New Zealand context. The results may vary, as the saying goes. But there is a clear indication that there is likely to be a net benefit of looking after those with addictions and looking after the mental health issues that go with them. Now that of course, is something that I suspect will be accepted around this House. the question comes as to how that will be funded. It's a net benefit to the economy, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't come with an accompanying cost in the health system. We're told in the papers produced by the government that there has been $775,000 given to the health sector for implementing similar legislation annually, and that should cover the cost of this increase. I guess the jury's out on that, and we will invite submissions to the Select Committee about whether that will realistically cover the costs in the sector, which is already stretched, hugely stretched. And members of this House will have people coming to see them in their electorate offices to describe some of the unfortunate consequences of a stretched health system in the area of mental health and addictions. I'm sure all members of this House have had people come to speak with them about those issues, many of which end in very tragic circumstances. And it is incumbent, I believe, upon this House to ensure that these kinds of changes are properly resourced so that the intent of looking after the vulnerable is realised rather than merely platitudes mouthed in this House. And we've got plenty of evidence that the health system is squeezed. There's 20 district health boards that have sent 160,000 people to their GP without specialist appointments since 2010. There is constant flow of information about the implications of an underfunded health sector. And with that figure of $1.7 billion in underfunding, it's little wonder that those areas where people are more vulnerable are the ones that tend to get squeezed first. The Labor Party has discovered through Official Information Act inquiries that this financial year, a further $163 million worth of cuts are being enforced across 17 district health boards. And of course, that all flows through. That number dwarfs the $775,000 that is claimed to fund this particular activity, as is listed in the regulatory impact statement. So we've got a health sector that is being squeezed by this government, and that is having negative consequences for the public of New Zealand, who are recognising that they cannot access the healthcare that they would expect in a prosperous nation. We've seen things like the drug Keytruda erupting into public debate, and I think that that is a symbol of a wider concern where medications are funded in the UK, in Australia and elsewhere that we cannot afford, it seems, in New Zealand under the current government, because the current government doesn't place the same priority on healthcare that a Labor government would. We on this side of the House in the Labor Party believe that the public health system must ensure essential healthcare services are provided free for all New Zealanders, and we believe that that health system is currently under threat. The health system is no longer able to provide Kiwis with high quality, safe patient care where and when it is needed in every case. And that is a sad situation to be in. So that is where I come back to the point, Mr. Speaker, that the promises in this legislation will need appropriate resourcing to be realised. There are other points in the regulatory impact statement that warrant highlighting in the first reading of this bill. There is very little international evidence on the effectiveness of civil compulsory substance addiction treatment in achieving good long-term outcomes for individuals. And while one might hope that shortening the period of compulsory treatment may go some way toward addressing that, perhaps with a modern progressive approach where buy-in of the patient comes earlier in the piece, new evidence will emerge that that is a more successful approach. But we must acknowledge that the evidence around compulsory substance addiction treatment is thin, and that is acknowledged indeed by the government in their regulatory impact statement. And so we also must recognise that there's little data in New Zealand on the number of people in New Zealand who have a severe substance addiction and may meet the proposed threshold for compulsory treatment. So we just don't know how many people this will apply to. The estimate of 200 that the government has brought to the table is a guess. It really is a guess, and the estimate of funding that will be supporting it is based upon the funding that they believe will be necessary to support a guess. The number of people who qualify for this or who may fall under the legislation may be a far greater number, and particularly in this day and age when we're observing growing inequalities in society, which has been very clearly linked through the literature to an increase in mental health concerns within a society. So we've got a case where we have a New Zealand that is not as it should be, where we have financial pressures growing on far too many, where the 1% charging ahead under the government that looks out for their interests, a government that's increasingly out of touch with the lot of ordinary New Zealanders, and therefore with that a growing number of people presenting with mental health issues. And you need to go and just need to speak with the police. A significant proportion of the police's work these days is concerned with mental health cases, and that happens increasingly in a society where there is that gap between the very, very wealthy, the ultra wealthy, and the rest of the country, where that gap between the richest and the poorest grows ever more. And so let's bear that in mind when we look at the estimates of the cost and the support that's been given to the DHBs to implement this legislation. That is where our concern will lie with this legislation, that the resources simply aren't there when the district health boards are being asked to make over $100 million, what was the figure I said earlier, in cuts this year alone, $163 million across 17 DHBs in cuts this financial year alone. In that circumstance, it is very hard to imagine just how they will afford to put this kind of legislation in place effectively in the spirit in which it is intended. And more than half of the DHBs in the country are running deficits at present, and indications from Treasury are that cost pressures, demographic changes and an ageing population will require even more significant changes to the health system over the coming years. This government doesn't seem to have a plan for our health system. This is one piece of legislation, though, that we can support because it modernises something and is in line with the recommendations of the Law Commission, which seem very, very sensible.
Speaker.
Simon O'Connor.